Today we're going to be talking about the Africans, another group that came to settle in Louisiana, just like the French and the Native Americans, but they came to settle in Louisiana for much different reasons than the French and the Native Americans. And we're going to find out what makes them different in a second. First of all, we need to ask, where did Africans come from? Well, Africa, of course. So let's look at our map to find out more. This is Africa. Many of the Africans came from this area, this shaded orange. They came across the Atlantic Ocean, and we see this arrow leading right to New Orleans. Now, there's a lot of movement of Africans at this time period. We're interested in that movement across the Atlantic Ocean from the east to New Orleans. The next big question is, why did Africans come to Louisiana? We say that they're one of those groups who crossed the ocean to get here. Well, why did they come? It's very different from the Native Americans or the French, who came for the natural resources like the Mississippi River. The Africans were actually forced to settle in Louisiana to work as slaves. They didn't choose to settle in Louisiana. They were brought there by the French and forced to work as slaves to make the French money. So what was life like for Africans? Well, as you can imagine, for a slave, life is very hard. They spent a lot of time out in the fields, working in the heat and the sun. They didn't have a lot of food or water many times, and it depended on how the owner decided to treat them. So some owners were very cruel, and they would whip them, and they would chain them up and tie them up and beat them and do a lot of terrible things when they didn't do what they were told. So life for many Africans in Louisiana was very hard. There were some Africans who were free. We called those free people of color. But unfortunately, most Africans were slaves. Now, how did Africans impact Louisiana? Sure, they didn't choose to come, and when they did come, they were forced to work as slaves. They didn't have any rights or freedoms. But that doesn't mean that they didn't bring their culture and make a big impact on Louisiana. And one way they did that is their food. They brought certain ingredients to Louisiana that now have become very popular in Louisiana and part of our traditional dishes. Also, music. A lot of Africans came and brought their musical traditions with them, and when they mixed with other musical traditions from France and other places, it created some new musical styles like jazz. Jazz started in New Orleans, and a lot of the early jazz musicians were African Americans. Now, how do we study Africans? Actually, how do we study anything in history? How do we know these things that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago? How do we know what happened? Well, we have two different ways that we get our information. One is primary sources, and these are sources created by people who were there at the time. So we can see photographs that give us information about what life was like at a certain time. We can also see diaries written by people who were actually there and described what they saw around them. These are great sources of getting information about what happened hundreds of years ago. Another source of information is secondary sources. These are sources created after the event. So sometimes historians will go and they will look at all the primary sources, and then they'll write an article explaining them about what happened. Or they'll write a history textbook explaining what happened in history. Now, the people who wrote these articles and these books, they weren't actually there. But they studied the primary sources, and then they explained it again in a way that's easy for you to understand. So remember, these are sources created after the event by someone who didn't actually see the event. They're just there to help you understand what happened in history. So today you're going to be looking at primary sources. Those are sources created at the moment that we're studying. So these are going to be slave narratives of Louisiana. Slave narratives are stories written by slaves who actually lived through slavery. So they're saying that this isn't something that I heard from someone. This is something that I saw with my own eyes, and this is what slavery was like in Louisiana. These are primary sources. Historians love looking at primary sources. They're so interesting, and they give us so much information. So you're going to be looking like a historian at some primary sources to learn what was life like for Africans living in slavery in Louisiana. All right, tomorrow we're going to talk about more settler groups. Have fun digging into those primary sources. It's going to be exciting stuff. Bye.